right, folks, we're going to get started with our session here. Thank you for everybody who's come to participate in the conversation about Africa and agriculture. Can Africa feed itself? I think we've already established through some of the earlier discussions that we've got this abundance of fertile and arable land on the continent, and therefore we should be in a unique position as far as self-sufficiency for food production. But we're not there, as we well know. In fact, I've got a statistic that in 2021, Africa imported more than $68 billion worth of farm products, despite possessing this natural endowment that we have. So the urgency of the situation is clear. We need to become self-sustaining and to feed ourselves as a continent. Part of the problem, of course, is take an example like cocoa, which is produced in huge amounts in Ghana, but processed in Switzerland. So how do we deal with this problem, and how do public-private partnerships help us alleviate the challenges that we face? Let me introduce my panelists, but perhaps before I do, we've got a little video from Ndidi Okonkwo Nwuneli, who is the Chief Executive President of the One Campaign. Let's take a look.
Good morning. My name is Ndidi Okonkwo Nwuneli. I'm the President and CEO of the One Campaign based in Washington, D.C. We are a global advocacy organization that works across the world fighting for investments and economic to fuel economic growth and healthy lives in Africa. I'm also the co-founder of Sahel Consulting Agriculture and Nutrition and Ace Foods Processing and Distribution, both based in Nigeria, and the founder of African Food Changemakers, which works with entrepreneurs in 40 African countries, really helping them scale their businesses. It's such an honor and privilege to be with you today to share some insights on whether Africa can feed itself. And I just want to share a few slides with you, which will bring my thought process to life. Just to summarize, I do believe that Africa can feed itself and the world. And I believe that we are naturally endowed for agricultural excellence, and this is one sector that we should be winning in. And I'm so glad that Standard Bank has prioritized this discussion and recognizes its role as a financial player in this space. I entered the food and agriculture sector after a very successful business career because I recognized that the continent was being left behind. And in fact, globally, this picture of Africa followed me around the world. The face of Africa being a hungry child and the face of poverty being a female farmer from Africa. This made me really angry. It made me angry because it's a single story. Africa is naturally endowed for agricultural excellence. Not only do we have the vast majority of our population working in the food and agricultural landscape, but we actually have 60% of the world's arable land, produce some of the best food in the world, our cashews, our cocoa, our plantains, our fonio, our rooibos, our tea, our cassava, and I could go on and on. But the rest of the world doesn't recognize our current contributions and our historical contributions to the food and agricultural landscape. It's also critical that we recognize our historical role in the food ecosystem. The more I've delved into the sector, the more excited I've been about Africa's role, not only in defining the future of food, but also setting its history. And if you look at this slide, you'd see pictures of okra. Okra is a vegetable that's widely eaten around the world. One photo is seafood okra from Nigeria, and the other photo is gumbo from New Orleans in the United States. And you can see how similar both cooking methods are. The word okra is actually an Igbo word, my language, from southeastern Nigeria, which was adopted by the whole world. And the word was first found in the annals of the colony of Virginia in 1679. And it's amazing how it's now spread across the world, and the cooking methods which were fostered by the transatlantic slave have been adopted around the world. And we have to package ourselves well and tell our stories to meet the needs of our customers in our countries, in our regions, but across the world. African food has to be packaged and has to have the highest quality standards. And this is where we have to set clear standards around food waste, around food safety, and around ensuring that African consumers deserve the best, and we hold producers accountable to process food that is world class. In addition, we need to put equity at the forefront of this sector. Women and youth are the backbone of the food and agricultural landscape in Africa, and they need support. They are early adopters of innovation and technology. However, they continue to be marginalized, with women really as primary producers and as small retailers. We need women in logistics. We need women in processing. We need women in all aspects of the food ecosystem. And finally, it's about policies. Another One campaign, my latest role, we are committed to not only driving and fighting for the funding that we need in Africa, but also the policies to ensure economic growth. And agri-food systems are critical to the economic growth in the continent. And we look forward to partnering with you to do more together to unlock this ecosystem. I started with a very sad picture, the face of Africa being a hungry child, and now I'm ending with a positive picture. And this is what I want to leave with you. My dream is that when you think of Africa, you think of these amazing children who go on to live full and meaningful lives because they're well nourished, because they have access to affordable food that's available and accessible, and because of the work we do collectively to transform the agriculture food ecosystem. Thank you.
That's a great video there for Ndidi to set our discussion. I'm going to introduce each of our panelists, and as I mention who you are, please would you come and join me on stage. The first person we're going to bring on stage joined, or at least he's the CEO of a majority family-owned business that started in Zimbabwe in 1950. He joined the family business in 2000 and grew a farming venture into the continent, initiating the startup of 5 greenfield projects in 5 new countries over a 15-year period. Their operations on the continent produce over 300 million chickens per year. He was also named EY's World Entrepreneur of the Year Masterclass category for Southern Africa in 2019. Please welcome Craig Irvin. Our next panelist has been with his company for about 50 years since its inception, and under his leadership, it's acquired the dry bean seed business of Pinar Seeds earlier this year. He's also a board member of the South African-Canada Chamber of Commerce. Please welcome Brian Lever, the Managing Director, AGT Foods. Our next panelist is the Chief Financial Officer, Africa, Middle East, where he oversees the financial aspects of his company's business in Africa and the Middle East. I'm told that he's a solutions-oriented executive in controlling and performance improvement with vast international experience both here in Africa, Europe, and North America. Please welcome Desiree Nzi, the Chief Financial Officer, Africa, Middle East, the Bula Group. You met our next panelist a little earlier on in the earlier discussions in the day. Marvin Ni Adom Amar is a senior account manager at Farmerline, where he has been working since 2021. He's a pragmatic engineer and project manager with outstanding knowledge and drive in both the technical and administrative sectors of the process and tech industry. Have a seat. And then just good old me, hey? I'll start off by asking each of you to make introductory remarks around the question that we are seized with today. Can Africa feed itself? Marvin, earlier you told us about amazing innovations that are happening in Ghana. Just frame for us, as you see it, can Africa feed itself? And if so, why have we not done so successfully until now?
All right. Thanks for the question. I think this is a question that is very dear to us at Farmerline because we so happen to work with smallholder farmers and understand the terrain. The answer to this is that Africa does have the potential to feed itself And we've seen this with stats, with data that has been presented in terms of how fertile our land is and how the opportunities to actually tap into. We believe that we've not been able to meet this potential because, first of all, there's been a lack in having to access information and being able to actually turn them into actionable items for farmers to benefit in. But beyond that, we also believe that there is a need for us to begin to look at how we can couch policies to actually help these smallholder farmers and how this can then be turned into the African context, so to speak. I did mention this in the earlier panel that it's not just enough to have technology now, it needs to be technology that can be impactful. And this is why we believe that Africa does have the potential. Yeah, thank you.
Desiree, can Africa feed itself? And if so, why have we not done so successfully until now?
Very simply, I say yes. Africa can feed itself. The question is now why it hasn't been possible. I see many roadblocks to that. A couple of them, and I think we will delve into that a bit more later. I can think of the infrastructure gap, because you need infrastructure, whether it's telecom, whether it's road, whether it's irrigation system, banking system, in order to gear up this development. There's a financing gap also, because this is a sector that is quite capital intensive, whether it's from the farming to the storage, the processing, and then distribution. And there's also a knowledge gap that we also need to fill through education and other activities. So yes, Africa can feed itself, but definitely some challenges.
Brian?
Thanks, Mogani. I think Africa can definitely feed itself. I think that I must concur with my colleague on the left here. First and foremost is an infrastructure issue, because to move the seed, you need to move the fertilizer, you need to move the chemicals. But once the crop has grown, you need to get it to market. And without proper infrastructure, training for people, farmers, and some assistance in the form of finance to start farming, I think we can definitely. And let me just tell you that I think it was in 2001 when the lady had the baby in the tree in Mozambique.
Yeah.
3 weeks after that, we delivered 58 truckloads of seed into 152 villages in Mozambique for the United Nations. And for 15 years, they never bought seed again for Mozambique. They were self-sufficient. They were producing enough for themselves. So it shows you it's easy to do once you have the funding, because people need to pay for seed, they need to pay for fertilizer. And without the money to pay for it, how are we going to start farming and feeding ourselves? But to answer your question, I think we can feed ourselves plus the rest of the world.
Craig, I'll let you also have a bite at that cherry.
Yes, thank you, Bongani. I certainly do believe that Africa can feed itself. If I think about our industry, the poultry industry is a very inclusive industry. Let's start. 80% of chicken consumed in sub-Saharan Africa, outside of South Africa and Egypt, is produced by small-scale farmers. So by being inclusive, the entry level is quite low. So you can become a crop farmer producing maize and soya into the integrations. And you don't need much capital to become a chicken farmer. So I think the inclusivity of it is great. It's low barrier to entry and brings people along with us. I think the good news is that really for us to feed ourselves, we just need sort of common sense policy. The bad news is easier said than done. We need consistent and clear policies around GMO, around inter-Africa trade, and from an animal health point of view, we need strong veterinary departments to regulate safe and free movement of products.
Greg, I'm going to ask you to just give us some context about Irvin's Africa and the work that you are doing, because of course we know the poultry sector has enormous potential and in fact has seen rapid growth in recent years.
So Irvin's Africa is a fully integrated chicken business. From our business here in South Africa, which is really a supply chain, we manufacture premixes, we trade with amino acids, commodities, basically anything that the feed producers require. We also supply vaccines and medications to all our customers across Africa. On the genetic side, we supply breeding stock, parent stock into 22 countries across Africa. And then across our own operations in Zimbabwe, Botswana, Mozambique, Tanzania, and Kenya, we produce day-old chicks and feed, which we supply to our 60,000 odd small-scale farmers across the region. We produce frozen chicken and table eggs. And we have quite a vast array of customers, all the way from specialist feed mill companies like EPOL here in South Africa, to KFC in Zimbabwe, to those 60,000 small-scale farmers across the region.
Brian, I'm also going to give you the same opportunity to just contextualize for us AGT Foods.
So AGT Foods Africa is part of AGT Food and Ingredients worldwide. But in the African context, we have always believed it's possible to produce anything in South Africa and to export it. So we started in early 2000s and started to produce popcorn for export, where we were at the time $150 a ton less than Argentina, because everybody said that's African production. Today we have one of the largest facilities in the world producing popcorn and exporting it, and we're $150 a ton more expensive than Argentina. So we have this belief that in Africa we can produce whatever we like. We also go throughout the value chain, from producing the grandparent to putting the product on the supermarket shelf, right throughout the value chain.
Part of what you have had to contend with, of course, is the import of things like pulse flours, starches, and seed. And to frame it more generically, how do geopolitical tensions that have nothing to do with what is being produced or can be produced in South Africa, how have those affected you?
I think sometimes you just have to look at life and say, it is what it is. If I must pay an import duty, I must pay an import duty. But for example, on a pea that you make soup with, the import duty is 30% if it's split to make soup, which is crazy because it's a basic foodstuff. So we just decided, okay, we're going to start and do trials and see how many ton we can produce in South Africa. We're now completely self-sufficient in producing the product and doing the splitting without the 30% duty and supplying the South African market.
So sometimes the problem is an opportunity.
Absolutely. But isn't that with life? Life is you wake up in the morning and you can either say, hey, there's too many problems today, or say, hey, how many opportunities do we have today?
Desiree, can you also contextualize the Bula Group for us?
Yes, of course. I will start by saying that Bühler is a family-owned business, 164 years old. And I think it's very important because that lays down the reason why we do what we do. And that gives us the possibility to really think long-term and make bold moves in certain markets where other companies would leave. We are in the business of feeding and moving people. I call it a hidden champion. Around 2 billion people every day will eat some type of food that is processed on Bühler equipment. And around 1 billion people would move with engine produced on Bühler equipment. In the feed part, we have solutions from post-harvest activities and everything that is related to the transformation of grain, cereals, and other type of pulses into flour, so semi-finished products, and then milling equipment, mixing equipment for finished products like pasta, noodles, etc., and also consumer goods or consumer foods like chocolates, biscuits. You referred to cocoa before. We'll have a great example of our long-term view and what we do in Ivory Coast for that. So that's a bit for Bühler. And in Africa, it's around 350 million Swiss franc turnover with 9 locations all across the continent, even in different countries like Nigeria, of course. South Africa, we are now since 50 years. 52 years more precisely, and actually very proud of that. And we continue to invest across the continent and find solutions for the problem into processing food on the continent.
Marvin, earlier we delved straight into the impact of some of the work that you have been doing in Ghana, but perhaps give us again a context of Farmerline and explain some of the remarkable success you've been enjoying.
Right. Yeah, thanks for that. So Farmerline is one of the fastest agribusinesses on the continent, and the main solutions that we are offering is powered by technology. What we're doing here is that we believe that smallholder farmers need to be given a voice, and in so doing, we understand the terrain and we understand how technology has a role to play in this. Beyond that, what we're doing also is that we believe that it's important to always have something tailored for farmers. So when it comes to every solution we put out there, the very thing you keep hearing will be that we are driving some bit of innovation, and at the same time, we are ensuring that these smallholder farmers are impacted the right way. The license that we have for our technology has been licensed in over 48 countries across the world, and that is actually merge data that offers different varieties of modules, be it traceability on digital finance, how to map, pick GPS coordinates, and also ensure that farmers are also being able to be financed. Right. Now, beyond this, what we've also been able to carve or achieve is that we have been able to leverage on connectivity to ensure that farmers stay informed all year round. So you hear some of the amazing innovations such as the DALI AI engine, also some others like the FLIT protocol, which allows farmers to just call and allow us to then pick certain basic data points from them in order for the system to generate the most recommended irrigation systems for them, right? And we are doing this in multiple countries, as I mentioned. And as I earlier said, we understand the role of smallholder farmers in Africa. We are talking about the men and women that put food on our table. We are talking about the same group of people that contribute to about 70% of the food on the continent. We're talking about the same individuals that also have employed about 50% of the workforce in the agricultural sector. Now, if you understand the role of smallholder farmers in what it takes to ensure that we are able to feed ourselves, we can do nothing else but to protect them. And in so doing, we need to constantly reinvent, right? That's Farmerline in a nutshell. Yeah.
What would you say have been some of your key strategies and steps that have helped you achieve the success that you have? But also, what challenges have you encountered along the way?
Right. Yes, so in terms of success, as I earlier mentioned, our major success has been for individuals who believe that smallholder farmers need to be protected. When you look at how we've actually couched this, there's technology that has been designed for the African context, and as mentioned, we started first of all by understanding the terrain. One of it is that we noticed that it wasn't enough to ensure that farmers had information altogether. It was also important to believe that the technology that we provided could be used within the African context. And what do I mean by that? A very important part of it is that offline functionality, which is mainly being used by most food companies like Hershey, Nestle, ETG Beyond Beans, basically to digitize farmers within their communities and ensure that information is being picked all year round. Now, if you quite recall, in the first panel, I did mention that we are indeed riddled by a lot of connectivity issues. And in fact, you don't expect farmers to have very sophisticated phones and devices to always connect to certain services. So we always need to ensure that the very little efforts that we can get to push information within the communities are constantly reinvented. But beyond that, there's the aspect of financing, which has always been a plague for farmers within our sector, and I'm sure the rest of the panelists would also agree to that. It is common knowledge that farmers actually form part of the group of people that are tagged as risky borrowers. Because, I mean, let's think about it. You're giving money to people that may not know what a season could look like, because it's a seasonal cash flow. They have no idea what their yield could be at the end of the season. And in so doing, when you actually look at the lending aspect, being the usual asset-based lending, it becomes a bit of a problem for farmers. Now, what we did some years ago was that we came up with an approach saying that farmers do have crops at every point in time. They may not have the yields that they require, but if you could have some skin in the game and ensure that farmers rather borrow in terms of commodity, where they can then pay back from what they've taken, that is in case they actually are not able to sell their crops at the end of the season, you would actually create some bit of market linkage. And that is what we've been doing all along. So when it comes to having to finance farmers, we actually go in for the commodity-based assets where we actually take produce from these farmers at the end of the season and create markets actually to help ensure that they're actually then producing all year round. But it hasn't been rosy, I should say. I mean, just like any other business, we've actually faced very intense challenges in different aspects.
Such as?
Yes, I would start first of all with having to expand in different regions. So if you look at the demographics, we got riddled a lot having to expand in areas such as the Francophone regions where certain policies were not as easy to penetrate. You're also dealing with people that sometimes could have an issue with adoption. And here we're talking about the farmers. Certain farmers just believe in their traditional ways of farming, and you can really change that. But when you actually begin to understand the reason why they've held on tight to these beliefs, it then becomes a bit easy to begin to unwind in terms of the workshops that we create, and then in terms of having to ensure that the education that we're giving is understood in local language. And then the last aspect of it will be that we also have faced challenges having to see different ways that a solution is used. For instance, sometimes you could have a situation where a government does pay for a solution and agribusinesses are using them. There's a different usage rate when it comes to that. We have instances where you also have, let's say, funders that are actually paying for a solution, and you have then, let's say, intermediaries like the smallholder farmers using it on the other end. All these actually pose a bit of challenges because we then understood that depending on how you approach having to diversify your portfolio or having to ensure that farmers have access to information, it just differs with different cultures, right? Yes, I think that's what I'll share when it comes to challenges, yeah.
Desiree, it's kind of been an issue at the back of my head most of the day, from Gulam's first presentation, really, as we started. Geopolitical uncertainty and conflicts now being major disruptors of trade routes. How has all of that affected your operations, and what opportunities has it presented?
There are several aspects to it. I will start with the striking statistics. If we take corn, wheat, and rice, roughly it's around 180 million tons a year that are consumed on the continent. And it corresponds to around 40 million tons that are wasted due to wrong storage or wrong handling. So that tells me two things. One, we do not consume exactly what we produce locally because most of it is imported. And secondly, we are even more so fragile when it comes to shocks. And the geopolitical tensions that we've seen, along with also the COVID crisis, basically showed that the continent is living really on food insecurity. And for Bühler, yes, it has an impact on our supply chain, on how we have to manage our net working capital, so cash, because we want to have the inventory to be able to deliver. But if I think more of our customers, the one who are actually feeding the people on the continent, I mean, this is even more so acute. No way to import their raw material. You have the spike in prices, and that is trickled then down to the end customer. So one approach that we're trying to look at and really develop, and I think it will be really a game changer for the continent, is improving the strategic storage reserves. Because that's actually bridge the gap between what we import and the necessity to waste less, but also allow the farmers who produce their crop to have a right way to store so that they are less subject to the fluctuation of the market. They have less pressure to sell their crops at probably a low price, etc., etc. So I think this is something that we're trying to really look at more in details, and we have examples that it works, and it's something that all the industry needs to make sure that it's looked at.
Brian, of course, we've barely recovered from the shocks of the pandemic, and that, of course, has affected global shipping. Is that still something to contend with?
So, Bongani, I think global shipping is a huge problem still today. And I saw last week that the freight rate on a 40-foot container from China to Europe has gone up by $9,000 per container. And the reason and the reason for that is because China is loading electric vehicles so fast to the UK that you cannot get empty containers to load any other cargo. Now, to me, it's absurd that electric vehicles can take precedence over food. It's just mind-blowing. But business is business. Big business is big business. But I think the other issue we're faced with is that you cannot just, there can be an African free trade agreement, but you cannot take corn or maize or seed and just put it on a truck and send it anywhere in Africa or from Africa back to South Africa. There's import permits required. There's phytosanitary certification that is required, which are huge trade barriers. And there's also vested interests involved in not allowing the goods in. So, for example, there's certain countries in East Africa, they just make it impossible for you to send seed in there. So how are they going to become self-sufficient in everything if you have these bureaucrats making everybody's life miserable trying to supply the seed to put in the ground to produce the crops? You need pest risk analysis. Then government to government needs to be resolved. That can take 10, 15 years. So I think if we can get rid of all the bureaucracy and all of that, then really there's no more barriers to trade. Africa can feed itself, plus the world.
Craig, let me pick up on that example. Irvin's Africa has expanded its operations to a number of African countries. What strategies have you employed to allow that expansion, and how do you circumvent the issues Brian is raising?
So I think with the poultry industry in Africa, let me set the size of the market. I mean, take India and China, combine them, add another 500 million people. By 2050, we have 2.5 billion people to feed. So the opportunity that we have is enormous. And all those people are going to need a quality source of protein. Consider that in South Africa, poultry consumption is about 24 kilos per person per year. If we look at Tanzania and Kenya, where we're investing now, it's 2 kilos per person per year. So just to double that, we require another 300 million broilers a year. And all of that needs maize, soya, and all the other inputs that go into it. So our approach to be competitive is that we want to compete in the global market. We don't look at the farm next door as our competitor. Our competitor is the Brazilians, is the Americans who are going to export into our markets. So our strategy has always been to use the best genetics available. We invest in modern facilities so that we are competing on the same basis as our overseas competitors. We invest in our people, and we adopt modern practices wherever we can. We have over 60,000 growers, as I mentioned before, and everything that we do is designed to service these growers. So we have a national footprint of stores where a customer can go in and buy their chicks, their feed, their vaccines, all the inputs that they need. So we're trying to decentralize the production. We also do free training to try and get the education level up, make sure that our farmers and our customers know what they're doing. But I think, in line with what Brian's saying, hands down, the biggest challenge that we face is bureaucracy. Never mind the multiple import permits that are required and the trade barriers, health certificates, just trying to get a health department in South Africa to talk to a health department in Brazil, it's almost impossible. And I think this adds a huge amount of cost to doing business in Africa, and is why, in one of the poorest regions in the world, our food cost is so high.
Brian, if we think about, being able to proclaim from Africa to the world, right? Because you said we can produce anything and sell it to anywhere. Are there any successes you can speak of, and what lessons do we learn from those?
Bongani, absolutely there are successes, because if you look, we ourselves have had two absolute huge successes. The one is the popcorn, where we ship now all over the world. 95% of what we produce, we export on a daily basis. And the other one, a couple of years, maybe 8-10 years ago, one of my sons walked into my office and said, I want to do a trial with mung beans. I said, and where are we going with these things? He says, no, we'll send them to Asia, India, China. I said, okay, let's do a trial. And within 3 years, we were up to shipping 20,000 ton a year from nothing. Never ever been produced in Africa, in South Africa or Botswana. We do our production in South Africa and Botswana. The whole of Africa was producing it. We are now still selling at $300 to $400 a ton more than Tanzania and Mozambique. Why? We produce, we start with proper seed, we process, we pack properly, and we ship it in containers. So the rest of them have to sell it to India or China, second-hand bags, hand-sewn, unprocessed. They don't get the price. So there never will be a price maker if you're doing no beneficiation whatsoever of that product in Africa. So there are absolutely, there's huge potential out of Africa.
Desiree, I'm going to remind you of a question that arose in an earlier panel discussion. I think it was Tunde's session. Was the question around, and I think the example was citrus farmers in Botswana. And one of the questions was around this free trade agreement and whether it's ultimately all talk and not much delivery in terms of what actually happens practically. I don't know if you remember that question.
No, but we can go on, yeah.
But I mean, essentially that is it. So the example that was given was there was a tit-for-tat arrangement around produce from Botswana and South Africa. And the question that was raised was, are we then just talking about free trade and not doing it? What's your response to that?
Well, that response can go for on and on and on. I think the starting point is it's important that we talk about it. Free trade and trade within Africa, as was explained before by the chief economist, is also an important way so that we can create a commonwealth for the continent. However, when we look at, in practice, at all of the countries that have ratified the agreement, how much are really implementing it? We are also have to think that when it comes to free trade, you need to consider that you also have a nascent industry in your own country. So what we see also is that countries are a bit reluctant to completely open because, of course, you look at your own little garden and you want to protect your industry. So that hinders also the free trade.
So is it all talk and little action, or is it still too early to tell?
For me, it's too early to tell. There's a lot of discussion around it, conferences. I'm yet to see the first concrete results.
I asked that question because, and maybe this is something for all of you panelists to deal with, what would you then think ought to be the milestones or the benchmarks that would signal some kind of process towards, or progress rather, towards self-sufficiency in answering the question, can Africa feed itself?
I'll go back to the statistics and thinking of that we import a lot of what we eat. So I think one of the first milestones is consuming what we produce locally. And I have an example that for me is absolutely striking. In Nigeria, on this very day, Buller is opening in Kano a grain processing innovation center. And this innovation center is solely dedicated to find ways to process local and ancient grains. So grains that are produced and grown on the continent. So for me, consuming what we produce is key. Secondly is all around processing capacities. And this comes with technologies and financing. And also The third one is really the policies to accompany and create a framework that is enticing for such kind of investments.
Marvin, what benchmarks, what milestones will indicate that we're making progress?
Right. I think for me, I usually would start from the level of the smallholder farmers, as always. And I'm looking at it being how can they be made to actually grow more, right? And be able to also curb things such as post-harvest losses. We're starting from a point where we understand that when it comes to even access to inputs, that's actually a problem to even start off with. We may not need to overcomplicate the issue, making it seem like we can't actually grow enough. The problem is that most farmers actually don't have what it takes to consistently grow all year round. And as I mentioned, this is why at some point in time we meet farmers that are riddled with new technologies. How then can they have new agronomic practices that can help in terms of their farming? And we're starting from this point because we believe that if we tackle it from the level of the farmer, it actually brings up a more holistic approach to how we are actually curbing the situation and how to actually make them sustainable in terms of their farming. So I would actually begin from a point where I believe that we need to have more incentivized ways to actually help farmers to grow more. And then beyond that, also including things such as irrigation systems. This is a major part. Now, mind you, in Ghana, as I mentioned earlier, we do have a wide range of farmers who have no irrigation systems installed on their farms. They are constantly looking up into the weather to be fed. And now this problem is becoming a major issue in the agricultural sector because we see what's happening with global and the global climate, and we see what's happening when it comes to weather conditions. Most farmers have no clue sometimes where there's rain patterns. And in so doing, when we begin to tackle it on that level, where they can always be informed to stay ahead of the conversation, we believe that that is where we begin to actually then curb the issue on whether or not we can feed ourselves.
How do we deal with that? I mean, is that something that they're meant to just figure out? Would that be state intervention in some way? How do we deal with that?
I think the private sector has a role to play in this. And I think I would start it from what Farmerline has been doing, right, in terms of how we are making this technology accessible. I mentioned the farmer-led irrigation systems, which is now a new technology that has been allowed to go into the communities for farmers. Now, how this works is that you don't expect farmers to have very technical knowledge on what irrigation systems to install. But what they can tell you, however, is what type of crops they grow. They can tell you what the seasonal outflow looks like. They can tell you how long it takes for a crop to actually reach a certain period. And these kind of factors are what we are using to sort of recommend the best irrigation system. But it doesn't just end there. Now, in a project that we just ended with the International Water Management Institute, what we came to understand is when we began to interview farmers on what they think about irrigation, you'll be surprised to know that most farmers actually did, at some point in time, move in to have irrigation systems, but most of them were either dealt with false people who had no irrigation systems and just took their money away, and that, in effect, made it a bit more unattractive for them to have to continue such conversations. So you'd happen to meet a whole catalog of farmers who have different ideas, but it comes down to one thing. One very common denominator among all the conversations we had is they all stated for a fact that we would want to have this, but the problem is we do not have access and we do not have the means to actually have such irrigation systems on the farm. As I mentioned, small-scale farmers constantly rely on rainfall. Semi-commercial farmers do have basic irrigation systems in place, but are often riddled with things such as water sources and also the very high maintenance costs when it comes to having to have these systems in place. So when we start from the private sector, I believe that when we can actually use technology to bridge this by informing farmers about the fact that, look, we actually do have suppliers to map onto you. We constantly had an intervention where we then decided that for the first time, we were going to build a whole database of irrigation suppliers within the country. And this is a project that just ended. So we do have now a whole database of suppliers for the entire country. And we started this in Ghana, actually. And when you look at the roadmap, you notice that at every point in time, maybe in just a 1 mile radius, you could actually have someone supplying irrigation system. But the problem is the farmers have no clue, and they don't even know which one to even go for in the first place. So I will begin with the fact that I believe that the private sector actually does have a role to play. But beyond that, I believe that the conversations and the interventions that we need to constantly put this in place is a very holistic one. The governments need to ensure that policies are ready to allow these farmers to easily undertake these sort of operations and then also be able to maintain them. Because what happens is that some of them do have them over a period, and then it breaks down, and then they just move on with their lives, saying that, well, we do not know what this really brought into our lives, so why then go back for it? But as we continue to constantly put these interventions in place, we realize that the sort of ideas behind this are changing, and it always starts with educating farmers and giving them that power to choose. Yeah.
Okay, so consume what we produce, make sure that you've got efforts that really start at a grassroots level, if you will. Brian, what milestones, what benchmarks do you want to put in place to get us to this place of self-sufficiency?
So, Bongani, I think that we need to break this down and say we have small-scale farmers, which are subsistence farmers, you have semi-commercial and you have commercial farmers. In South Africa, we're very fortunate. Most of our farmers are huge commercial farmers. We produce more than enough food for ourselves to export to the continent, to export all over the world. I think that outside of South Africa, I think the first and foremost, you need to have a government that's willing and able to partner with private enterprise. Because private enterprise can go in, contract a village through the village chief and get the whole village to grow the same thing as long as they're going to fetch it, take it to market and give the village headman a price before he puts it in the ground. Because there are huge amounts of food produced all over Africa where they can't sell it when they get it out the ground. There's no one to come and buy it. So if you go in and you contract it before, and in Zimbabwe it used to be done extremely successful. There's a man by the name of Rob Kelly. He just produced hundreds of thousands of tons like that. Because you gave the man a price, said, you get the whole village, you the chief, let the whole village produce, bring to a central point, we will come, we will buy, we will give you the money, you pay the village, and off we go. It's distribution. It's market access. Market access is the most important thing because anybody can grow something. But not everybody has a market and can find a market, especially if you're 500 kilometers from the nearest big town. How are you going to find a market? Who are you going to pay to move it to market for you? And then you have the bureaucracy that fits into this with all of these permits and HACCP and FSSC and all of, you cannot expect a subsistence farmer to even start to certify his farm, to get his farm inspected and to do all of that. Because by the time he's finished doing that, there's no money left for him anyway. So I think more important than just saying we can't produce enough, we just need to get together big business, government, and the headmen of all the tribes, all the little villages, and we can actually make this thing work beautifully.
Craig, glass half full. What benchmarks, what milestones can we aim for to say we're on the right path?
No, I mean, I agree with Brian. I mean, I believe in free markets, right? So I think government should provide the necessary environment to allow farmers to thrive. And we need to be able to stop importing the bulk of our food products and the inputs into those food products. It saves foreign currency, it mitigates a lot of risk. And I think what we need to do is to see those small-scale farmers developing into medium-scale farmers and into large-scale farmers. I mean, it's crazy that we have to import GMO soya in some countries. We're importing it from India when we have Zambia literally across the border. I mean, so there's a huge amount of policy that has to happen. And I think really at the end of the day, government needs to let private sector get on with the job. I mean, I don't think government can do it better than private sector.
I'm going to open it up to the floor. Perhaps there are questions. I don't want to hog the conversation. I don't even think we need a mic. Perhaps if you've got a question, just indicate and we can let you have it. Any takers? Please go ahead. All right, I think we will grab a microphone. We've just got one coming there from the back. My own mic deceives me into thinking it's a smaller room.
Good day. I'm Israel Chitenda from Namibia. We mostly into importation of agricultural machines, machineries. Perhaps not a question, but I just want to add on to the second speaker from the right. What you mentioned, it's something that I think it's a conversation that we've been having, a group of people, of friends in Namibia, where we say, okay, the access to markets is what is the most difficult part, most of the time for small farmers. So the concept of getting into a village or getting few people with small hectares of land to produce one product and getting into the market, I think that is it's something that may help a lot of small farmers to get to the market. Of course, with Standard Bank as organizing this type of conferences, so ideas are shared. It's also very important. Back home, like I said, we are into supplying of agricultural machines. There is, of course, a big fund that the African Development Bank has given to government to provide agricultural equipment for small farmers. And the next step then will be for the industry to open up markets and ideas to the small farmers so they get into the mainstream of producing this product.
Are there no risks, though, with that type of arrangement? Because the small farmer, the village, is completely at the mercy of whatever private player they're dealing with. What are the possibilities for things like exploitation, and how do we deal with that?
Yeah, but you see, Bongani, that is unfortunately life. You need to know who you're dealing with. And you need to try and see that you make sure that the partner that you pick is the right partner. Because the village, if they're planting, can't run away. They're not picking up their village and moving it. So the problem is the private sector player who has come and said, can you do this for me and can you do that? And I'm sure in most countries people know and understand who the players are.
Yeah, but sometimes it's not even because of, bad motives. They may also be dealing with factors beyond their own control. The environment changes. There are lots of variables that could come into it. So it may not necessarily be because there was a motive to exploit, but it can go there.
Look,
there are risks.
But we do it with commercial farmers all year, every year, plenty of them. And our strike rate is pretty good. We really don't have. I mean, I think Craig is the one to ask that question. He's got 60,000 farmers buying chickens from him and medicine. What's his percentage bad debt does he have of those 60,000 farmers?
No, we don't have bad debts on
You
those.
see?
Okay.
Because he knows his farmers and they know him.
Know who you're dealing with.
Yeah.
Any other questions? We've got one there.
Hi, Yaku from How We Made It in Africa. It would be great if each of the panelists could identify one untapped business opportunity that you see in Africa's agriculture, food industry, and maybe a sentence explanation on why. And you don't have to pick your own industry, maybe just something that you think could be a money-making idea.
We're all listening. We're ready to invest. Standard Bank will finance. Great.
I think in the meat sector generally, we need to be able to find some sort of heat-stable form of protein to go into the market. I mean, one of the biggest challenges that we have is lack of refrigeration because of lack of power infrastructure. So if I think if you find some sort of really heat-stable, long shelf life type of product, that would be a real winner.
Bongani, I must be honest with you, I never thought about this. What is another opportunity in Africa that is untapped? I mean, we've got 1.8 billion people. Surely everybody's thought of something. I mean, Craig says he wants a meat, a protein. So I can give you 85% protein from peas. Heat stable because it comes in powder form. We ship it to you in 1-ton bags. So I really can't give you an answer to that. I must be very honest.
Fair enough. Desiree?
Yeah, talking about protein, a very specific example that actually shocked me is about Côte d'Ivoire. Côte d'Ivoire consume around, I think, 800,000 tons of fish every year. 80% of that is imported. So we're coastal countries. We have many rivers, but we still import fish. So here's for you, fish farming, Côte d'Ivoire, bingo.
Marvin?
Right. Yeah, that's a tough one, actually. But I think I would go in for the technology aspects, actually, because that's our expertise. I would go in for the topic on traceability, being a very important aspect of, a very untapped area in Africa. And this actually happens to be one of the technologies that are emerging, but has been sort of stifled, right, with regards to how people actually approach it. And the reason why I say that is that, subject to what people think, traceability is not just for manufacturing companies, right? Like the car manufacturing companies or those that actually are subject to recalling certain goods and services. It actually goes beyond that, and it sits at the core of almost every business functionality. Now, the reason we say this is because when we actually began to trace food, and maybe for those of you who may not have heard of traceability before, this is basically just the commodity life cycle tracking of food, right? Where you can actually tell that you bought from this farmer, it went through this warehouse, it goes through this point, and at this point, this is where it actually got consumed. Now, what we began to do with that data was that most companies began to invest in that data, because in so doing, they were able to tell lapses within their supply chain where they were either losing products or aspects that were not, pretty much well figured out. And this is actually a part that has become a very important aspect of the services that we provide. And you see certain companies actually approaching this in different ways. Some are doing this using QR codes that are being tagged to food all the way down to suppliers. And I must say that Africa also needs to be ready, especially when it comes to the aspect of traceability, because just as I mentioned in the first panel, there are regulations that are slowly taking countries out of the export business because they cannot actually prove that the food that they are sourcing from are coming from areas of little or no deforestation. So I think that is what I would probably pick as an area that we may need to,
Because
put
sustainability is something to consider going forward. Well, I think that's about all the time we have for our discussion. Thank you very much to all the panelists. Thank you for your attention. I think what we're going to do now is have one more networking break, and then we'll go into the final session in the main plenary room at 5 o'clock, and that will be it for the day. Thank you.